To give this argument a stricter form, let us imagine a straight line of unlimited length, and on this line a material point A, which moves. If this point were conscious of itself, it would feel itself change. Since it moves, it would perceive a succession. But would the succession assume for it the form of a line? No doubt it would, if it could rise, so to speak, above the line which it traverses, and perceive simultaneously several points of it in juxtaposition. But by doing so, it would form the idea of space, and it is in space and not in pure duration that it would see displayed the changes which it undergoes. We put our finger on the mistake of those who regard pure duration as something similar to space, but of a simpler nature. They are fond of setting psychic states side by side, of forming a chain or line of them, and do not imagine that they are introducing into this operation the idea of space properly so called, the idea of space in its totality, because space is a medium of 3 dimensions. But how can they fail to notice that, in order to perceive a line as a line, it is necessary to take up a position outside it, to take account of the void which surrounds it, and consequently to think a space of 3 dimensions? If our conscious point A does not yet possess the idea of space, and this is the hypothesis which we have agreed to adopt, the succession of states through which it passes cannot assume for it the form of a line, but its sensations will add themselves dynamically to one another and will organize themselves, like the successive notes of a tune by which we allow ourselves to be lulled and soothed. In a word, pure duration might well be nothing but a succession of qualitative changes, which melt into and permeate one another, without precise outlines, without any tendency to externalize themselves in relation to one another, without any affiliation with number. It would be pure heterogeneity. But for the present we shall not insist upon this point. It is enough for us to have shown that, from the moment when you attribute the least homogeneity to duration, you surreptitiously introduce space. It is true that we count successive moments of duration, and that, because of its relations with number, time at first seems to us to be a measurable magnitude, just like space. But there is here an important distinction to be made. I say, for instance, that a minute has just elapsed, and I mean by this that a pendulum, beating the seconds, has completed 60 oscillations. If I picture these 60 oscillations to myself all at once by a single mental perception, I exclude by hypothesis the idea of a succession. I do not think of 60 strokes which succeed one another, but of 60 points on a fixed line, each of one symbolizes, so to speak, an oscillation of the pendulum. If, on the other hand, I wish to picture these 60 oscillations in succession, but without altering the way they are produced in space, I shall be compelled to think of each oscillation to the exclusion of the recollection of the preceding one, for space has preserved no trace in it. But by doing so, I shall condemn myself to remain forever in the present. I shall give up the attempt to think a succession or a duration. Now, if finally I retain the recollection of the preceding oscillation together with the image of the present oscillation, one of 2 things will happen. Either I shall set the 2 images side by side, and we fall back on our first hypothesis, or I shall perceive one and the other, each permeating the other and organizing themselves like the notes of a tune, so as to form what we shall call a continuous or qualitative multiplicity with no resemblance to number. I shall thus get the image of pure duration, but I shall have entirely got rid of the idea of a homogeneous medium or a measurable quantity. By carefully examining our consciousness, we shall recognize that it proceeds in this way whenever it refrains from representing duration symbolically. When the regular oscillations of the pendulum make us sleepy, is it the last sound heard, the last movement perceived, which produces this effect? No, undoubtedly not. For why, then, should not the first have done the same? Is it the recollection of the preceding sounds or movements, set in juxtaposition to the last one? But this same recollection, if it is later on set in juxtaposition to a single sound or movement, will remain without effect. Hence we must admit that the sounds combined with one another and acted, not only by their quantity as quantity, but by the quality which their quantity exhibited, that is, by the rhythmic organization of the whole. Could the effect of a slight but continuous stimulation be understood in any other way? If the sensation remained always the same, it would continue to be indefinitely slight and indefinitely bearable. But the fact is that each increase of stimulation is taken up into the preceding stimulations, and that the whole produces on us the effect of a musical phrase which is constantly on the point of ending, and constantly altered in its totality by the addition of some new note. If we assert that it is always the same sensation, the reason is that we are thinking, not of the sensation itself, but of its objective cause situated in space. We then set it out in space in its turn, and in place of an organism which develops, in place of changes which permeate one another, we perceive one and the same sensation stretching itself out lengthwise, so to speak, and setting itself in juxtaposition to itself without limit. Pure duration, that which consciousness perceives, must thus be reckoned among the so-called intensive magnitudes, if intensities can be called magnitudes. Strictly speaking, however, it is not a quantity, and as soon as we try to measure it, we unwittingly replace it by space.